The reviews I've ordered will surely tell us more. What already is apparent is that there was a mix of human and systemic failures that contributed to this potential catastrophic breach of security.
Well, that was President Obama late this afternoon addressing the attempted Christmas Day terror attack for the second time in as many days. And let's bring in the panel. Fred Barnes of the Weekly Standard, A.B. Stoddard of The Hill, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. The president tried again today to get out ahead of the outrage over the lapses that led or contributed to this this man getting on this plane and attempting to set off a bomb. Charles, how did the president do this time?
Well, this was an exercise in image repair. The president pretended that the reason he came out a day after his first address was because there was new information, and he cited the fact that the Nigerian attacker's father had appeared in the embassy. Of course, that was known already early in the weekend. And secondly, he said that whereas the information had left the U.S. Embassy in Nigeria, it arrived in Washington, it hadn't been properly shared, but everybody knew that as well.
So why did he come out?
Because there's outrage here at the incompetence of this administration, the fact that his Secretary of Homeland Security, who's clearly over her head, had gone out on Sunday and pretended that the system had succeeded and then had to walk it back. And that when the president had come out himself after waiting 3 days, he appeared detached and cool, and he spoke about this as a criminal act, speaking about a suspect, speaking about an alleged attempt, speaking about it as an isolated extremist. In fact, we already knew about the connection in Yemen. This is an attempt by the administration, by the president himself, over and over again, to disconnect these kinds of attacks from the war on terror, which of course he declared over at his inauguration, and which unfortunately Al-Qaeda has not. And as a result of that, you know, people ought to ask him, do you still believe he's like isolated extremist? People ought to ask him, and today he repeated the word extremist over and over again. What kind of extremist is he? Is he a jihadist? And lastly, people ought to ask him, are you still intent on releasing the 80 Yemenis in Guantanamo? Lieberman said Iraq is the war of yesterday, Afghanistan the war of today, and Yemen the war of tomorrow. It will be a lot easier to handle these 80 Yemenis in Guantanamo than in the wilds of Yemen, which is where they're going to end up if released, and plan the more attacks on the United States.
I'm just getting a report, A.B., as we're talking. And Doug, where did that come from? Who's reporting that? Fox can confirm that the CIA had apparently been tracking this fella, Abdul Muttalib, since August. And so it seems that the lapse, the failure to connect the dots, if you will, really is more egregious than we even knew about.
This is amazing. I agree with Charles that the president came out to try to get ahead of the outrage because he acknowledged no outrage yesterday. This is just a staggering story, the fact that this man, what we know there will be a next time, and we won't be lucky enough to have a warning from someone's father, and why this man was able to stay on this broad list and never make it to a selectee list where he would require more screening, or a no-fly list, now to learn that the CIA has been tracking him and that we still had him on a plane, possibly without passport, but definitely one-way, no luggage, in cash, all the warning signals ignored, is just so incredible. And the president has to acknowledge that everyone is asking these questions. Everybody knows this was a systemic failure.
Fred, it's interesting. This is not the first time that this president, this administration, has had this problem of being slow off the mark to kind of understand where the public's mood was. I think particularly back to last June, when there were an awful lot of people around the country and the world who were outraged by the carnage in the streets after the Iranian election, and it took day after day after day before finally the president kind of caught up with public opinion. And he seems to have taken, what is it now, about 5 days to have caught up with public outrage about the lapses that led to this guy being on that plane.
He's been awfully slow, but I think there's something, and I think you were on to something, Chris, a minute or two ago when we heard about that the CIA had been tracking this guy. Sure, the president wants to get out ahead of public opinion, or at least on the right side, but he also wants to get out ahead of the facts. You know, when he used the word catastrophic Catastrophic's a pretty extreme word. That's a tough word. So you know there are more facts coming out. The first one is about the CIA having tracked its terrorists. There are other things too. You know, it's been reported that the terrorists actually had met with, at least once and maybe more times, the same imam in Yemen who had been doing all the emails with Captain Hassan of the Fort...
Major Hassan.
Major Hassan of the... didn't mean to demote him. Major Hassan of the Fort Hood massacre. And now we hear another story going around is that his father, the Nigerian banker, didn't just go to the U.S. Embassy once. He went there 3 times. And yet all these things happened, and he still gets on the plane.
You know, Charles, you talked about Janet Napolitano, the Secretary of Homeland Security, former governor of Arizona, and you said you think she's over her head. It seems that this phrase that she used last week and in several appearances on Sunday shows where she said the system worked is now going to rival George W. Bush during Katrina saying you're doing a heck of a job, Ronnie. I mean, it is becoming part of the national conversation.
It's unfortunate, but whatever happens in her career, this will be how we remember her. The person who said 2 days after an attack that almost killed 300 Americans that the system had worked. She was a decent governor. She shouldn't be in this position. She has no experience, and her reaction was entirely inappropriate. But the president also, it's his reaction. The reason he showed up again today is because yesterday he just looks cool and detached and unconcerned. He shows up without a tie, and then he says in his statement, "We will not rest until we find those involved." And then he hops into a golf cart and continues his games. You know, this is serious stuff. You have to demonstrate seriousness. And the fact that he continually avoids speaking of the nature of the enemy, which is jihadism, is a sign of him not willing to acknowledge what every American understands is reality.
All right, real quick.
One other thing. You can't avoid the impression that rather than being on offense in the fight against terrorism, they're on defense. I agree with what Senator Dianne Feinstein said the other day, that, look, if you're going to err in the war on terrorism, err on the side of overreacting rather than underreacting. The Bush administration's policy was to overreact. It seems like the Obama policy is to underreact.
And we should point out Dianne Feinstein, the Democratic chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee.
Indeed.
All right, we have to step aside for a moment. But when we come back, Iran continues its crackdown on pro